Well, a very, very warm welcome to this special live recording of Planet Possible. And if you've not heard the show before, then Planet Possible is a water and environment podcast where we explore some of the biggest topics that are facing our world. Our guests are experts, professionals and campaigners working in the water and environment space, and we always try and take an evidence-led and objective view. I am really delighted that we are joined by a world-renowned conservationist, broadcaster, photographer and mental health advocate. So let's hear a very warm welcome from my guest, Chris Packham. Brilliant. Well, thank you for joining us, Chris.
A pleasure.
Let's get started straight away, if that's okay.
Let's dive in. We autists don't do small talk.
There's plenty to get through as well in half an hour. There is so much that we could cover today. So let's start with the kind of state of the nation. When we think about nature, our climate, the environment, what's giving you the most concern right now?
My daily social media feed at about 6 o'clock every morning when the poodles get fidgety is alive with very concerning data. So I think let's deal with biodiversity first. We are very fortunate in the UK to have an enormous number of volunteers, amateurs and professionals who have really got their finger on the pulse of our monitored species distributions and populations. So when we come up with the stats and the data, we can be assured that we are probably the most accurate anywhere in the world. Relatively small collection of nations with some very, very talented people that are looking at those and have been doing so for a long time with compatible data. And what our State of Nature reports, and the 4 of which have been published so far this year, what they tell us is that most of our principal habitats are in decline. 16% of our species are in danger of extinction, and they continue to chart catastrophic declines in particular guilds of species. And we lump those together in very broad categories such as seabirds or farmland birds, and we use those as indicators. And it's very clear that the UK is in parlous and serious decline. So whilst we stand in car parks as ornithologists and we love the fact that we've reintroduced ospreys and white-tailed eagles to the south of England, and they now fly above little egrets that certainly weren't there when I had my first pair of binoculars, the wider picture is pretty serious. Thankfully, people are working on many other species, and we see, again, significant declines in insects, 25% decline in large flying insects over the last 20 years, figures which are replicated in Europe, in Germany and France, and of course the impact of that is significant when it comes to other insects and everything that eats them, birds and bats and so on and so forth. So yeah, we're in deep, deep trouble. It causes me no end of guilt. I've been doing everything within my power, but not enough, to try and address those declines. And so whilst we've been charting them, we have been coming up with a range of abilities to repair, restore, reinstate, reintroduce, but we haven't rolled them out broadly enough and rapidly enough, and we've shied away from dealing with the bigger issues, which brings us to bigger issues than the UK's biodiversity, and that is global biodiversity loss. We've lost 69% of the world's wildlife since 1970. And then we've got climate breakdown and the effects of that we're seeing through weather influenced by the breakdown in our climate is becoming ever more severe. And there can't be a single one of us that isn't aware of the flooding that's been taking place in Central Europe this year, the extraordinary high sea temperatures, the threat to the breakdown of the AMOC current, and who's going on holiday to Greece when it's on fire. So, you know, it's beginning to come home, the fact that it's not something that's a forthcoming risk, it's a contemporary reality. And of course, the key thing that gets lost in many of the conversations is that biodiversity loss, climate breakdown, so many of the other factors are all intrinsically intertwined. They're not a separate thing. And I think that sometimes that can mean that people perceive them as an existential problem and they don't look into them to see the opportunities that they provide. And there are opportunities to make positive moves, but I think people are terrified by the scale of the problem, and that can sometimes put them off.
Yeah, well, you've painted a really stark picture. I wouldn't expect anything less, and thank you for doing that. I suppose we're Planet Possible for a reason, so we're really interested in, well, how do we start to find those connections and solve those problems? We are, about 70 days into a new Labour government here in the UK, and you've talked about us needing some radical action and some movement. How are the new government doing so far, in your opinion?
Well, we are 70 days on the calendar, but not 70 days in their office. And I was at the House of Commons the other day, and we were totting it up, and that was last week, and we calculated they'd actually had 14 to 16 days of meaningful governance, because they obviously won the election and went into summer recess. They are now back, but we're straight into the conference season. So I think what we've seen is this government making some gestures, and hopefully some of those are indications about what they properly intend to do in the future. I mean, not all of those gestures. I mean, let's just focus on the environment and not get into winter fuel allowances and everything else. That's not my business. But I think that we've seen onshore wind sanctioned. We've seen investment in solar. We've seen the fact that they are not going to appeal against the Rosebank thing in the wake of Sarah Finch, which is great. But at the same time, on the biodiversity side, we've not got what we wanted initially about the badger cull. So that could continue as things stand for another 5 years, which means we've got a fight on our hands there. And then I was on the banks of the Thames the other day when Steve Reed was announcing water policy. The gesture is that there's going to be more accountability. The dividends will be restricted. I think that will reinstate some confidence in the public that they're not being totally ripped off by the water bosses and the water companies. But then he also announced that there was going to be a review. I'm not terribly fond of reviews, because we've seen one with Grenfell. It was 10 years ago, and now there's still not proper accountability. And what we know about all the prophecies of doom that I was perhaps outlining at the start is we don't have 10 years. The scientists have given us 5 years at most, and that's not 5 years to keep things as they are. That's 5 years to put measures in place which will keep our planet a livable space. The situation is critical, but we have the capacity, if we move, to make those differences. And I think, therefore, one of the principal messages to the new government has to be escalate. The targets that people are putting in place. And again, I had a meeting this week with the Environment Agency, and it was a very positive meeting, and it was great, and a lot of good things came out of that. But they did at one point mention a target for 2100. And I was just thinking, well, you know, it's going to be a very different world in 2100. So I think that focusing on immediate crisis management is where we need to lead them. But look, we have the optimism of a new government. We've got some good people in place. They've got some good ideas. I think we've got to give them longer than 16 days to get those working. So at the moment, I'm exercising, and it's not easy for me, but I'm exercising some patience and keeping the doors open for as long as possible before we get into any sort of what you might describe as, you know, an opposition to some of their policies.
Sure. And that's something I'm keen to talk to you about. So when I shared on social media that I was going to talk to Chris today, and I asked people that listen to Planet Possible, what would you like me to ask him if you were sitting up here? One of the things that people were keen on was about how we find the middle ground. So I did a bit of research, and you yourself have said we need to stop fighting and look for effective compromise in terms of both conservation and wholesale care of the environment. So I'm interested specifically in where's that space where campaigners who are making a real impact, and then people that are working in the water sector, for example, how do we find that middle ground? How do we find that compromise?
Well, I think it's about regulating our patience. That's the first thing. I mean, I do think there are some compromises that we've passed, and therefore we do just simply need mandatory changes. And therefore we need to instigate those transitions, and that's a key word for me. I'll come on to it in a moment, but, you know, as rapidly as possible. So I do think there are some things where we don't have time for compromise anymore. In fact, we don't really even have time for creative conversation. We've established what we need to do, so therefore we must do it.
Give me an example, Chris. What are you thinking specifically?
Well, very simply, we've got to leave fossil fuels in the ground. And for that reason, we should be moving towards that transition to renewables far more rapidly than we are now. That doesn't mean that we want to turn the taps off overnight. Everyone would go cold, nothing would be powered. We're not unrealistic in our demands, but we listen to the science, and the science is simple, and that is that for any hope of, well, I mean, it was 1.5, they're now talking at 2 degrees, and we think that's probably impossible, and anything above that, very large parts of our planet become unlivable from a human point of view. So it's clear that we've got to escalate that transition. And that means injecting money, effort, ability and ideas into that transition and working with that industry to move out. But the lethargy and lies that we see from the large fossil fuel corporates at the moment are frankly genocidal and ecocidal. We don't have that time. So I don't think that there's any sort of ambiguity about the fact that we have to make those sorts of moves. But where we need to exercise our patience is the T word, is the transition, because that patience is a key ingredient for an effective transition. And I think another key ingredient is kindness. We know we've got to get rid of fossil fuel, that we don't want everyone who works in that industry to be on the streets tomorrow.
Sure.
We've got to move away from animal agriculture. We've got to eat less meat, and we've got to cut back on dairy. I don't want to shut down every dairy farm tomorrow, even if they are murdering 230,000 badgers unnecessarily. But the key thing is we've got to work with those communities. And I think where everyone needs a wake-up call is that the change has got to happen. And where we see blind resistance to change, the continuation of the badger cull, for instance, which we all know is ineffective and uneconomic, inhumane, and so forth, to continue it is entirely foolhardy. So I do think that it's time for the conservationists, the campaigners principally, not the conservationists, have done precious little about the badger cull, but the campaigners and principally the NFU to bang their heads together and say, look, what are we going to do here? And that's another sort of approach where I take a slightly different angle, and that is that I think if you are going to oppose something, you have to propose something. You've got to come up with something positive. So the angle that we are taking as a case with the badger cull is that we've looked very carefully at how we would address the issue of BTB. It's not going to go away if we stop killing badgers. It's going to continue because badgers haven't started it in the first place. So what we've looked at is a range of, without getting into too much detail, testing techniques that are used effectively in the other parts of the world and have significantly reduced the impact of BTB in cattle herds. So it comes at a cost. It means retraining, it means investment, it means patience from both sides, both the farming fraternity and the campaigners for wildlife. But I've got a draft on my kitchen worktop at the moment, which I intend to give to Steve Reed when we get to meet next and say, look, here is a solution. It's costed out, it's tested, it's backed by science. So I'm not just saying stop the cull, I'm saying stop it and do this. And I think that sort of proactive, positive, progressive approach is something that some of our campaigns would benefit from taking. So Just Stop Oil are great, and I continue to support them, and they do want a transition. They don't want to turn the taps off, but what we haven't done there is looked at a far-reaching urgent economic model where we can make sure that the vast and grotesque profits that are being made by those industries are turned into significant reinvestment to secure the future for their workforce, basically.
For me, what I've really taken away is that being proactive and coming with solutions. And I think it would be really exciting. I think the campaigners, certainly in the water and environment space, are making really big waves, if you excuse the terrible pun, about agitating for change. I think what I'm interested in then is, well, so what then? So how do we find a space where we can work collaboratively to solve some of those issues?
I'm an old punk rocker, and as an angry young man, I've unfortunately had to become an angry older man. But one of the things that I learned all those years ago, way back in the 70s, is that anger can be an energy, but you can only use it effectively if you turn it into something creative. So from my point of view, again, when I'm confronted by anything which I perceive as a problem, I immediately start looking at it, breaking it down, dissecting it, and looking for the opportunities within that problem. And what's clear in an exhibition like this today is that there are boundless opportunities. And those include securing a future for everyone here who works, their families, their industries, if we can only channel the effort and investment into them to make them viable. But we need to do it a lot more quickly than we are doing now.
Sure. No, I definitely hear that pace. So that makes me start to think about the next generation. So if we move on a little bit from the kind of state of the nation, I am somebody who grew up with the Really Wild show. So I'm, totally fangirling about the fact that I'm sat next to Chris Packham. But what the Really Wild show and programmes like it have done, I guess, is really inspired and engaged that next generation and taught them something about the world. So from your kind of years of broadcasting experience, how do we, particularly in the face of what is a really stark picture that you painted, Chris, at the beginning, how do we engage and inspire the next generation to want to work in this sector, for example, and want to affect change?
Well, I think we've got to engage them with it, and that means firsthand. And I think that one of the things that we've done is effectively lock young people out of that enriching environment, which you might just call the countryside. So one of the rarest species in the UK countryside now is a young person exploring that resource. Now, when I was a kid, I'd get home from school, I'd throw the satchel in the corner of the room, and I'd be over the fence before my mum could say homework. It was about touching, it was about meeting, it was about generating that deep-rooted affinity and curiosity for life. And I think that once that spark is lit, the flame may waver through various other interests and distractions in life, but it's something that you retain. And I think unless we love something, then why are we going to get out of bed to look after it? I think the one thing we have to realise is that we don't need all of anyone to develop that passion and need to act upon it. Again, what the maths, what the science says is that for social change to take place, we need 25% of the population. A lot of young people come to me and say, it's a hopeless situation, I'm the only person in my class that cares. Right. And I say to them, well, at this point you are, but that will grow. And ultimately, you only need a quarter of your class to care before things will change significantly. So if you're walking down the precinct and you think all everyone's interested in is shopping, so long as it's only 75% of them, it actually doesn't matter. And our job is to lead, whatever it happens to be, to get that sort of social change. So don't worry about everyone. Just worry about growing your community is my message to them. But I do fear that if young people can't feel the tickle of tadpoles on the palm of their hands, or they're not going to get scratched by brambles or stung by nettles, what is going to connect them to that environment to the point that they are going to get up and seriously fight for it? So, rather than imprisoning them in front of the internet, which I would argue is a far more dangerous place than most of the woods around my place, it's a way of making sure that they get back there. So every opportunity to do that must be taken. And we have another issue in the UK, and that is if I turn up of a Sunday morning to help out a Wildlife Trust or RSPB group, it's Volvos and Audis that turn up with white middle-class kids. Another thing that we've significantly failed at when it comes to engaging people with nature in the UK is extending that across a much broader section of our culture. And we don't see enough people of colour engaging. They don't have the role models. I'm a white was working class, now a middle class bloke of 63. I mean, I don't have a beard and a barber, but it's not the answer. Sure. We need those role models. We need to make those spaces accessible. Conservation NGOs in the UK have the lowest percentage of ethnic minority groups working for them than any other sector. It's a disgrace, an absolute disgrace. And it's something that, again, we should have been addressing far more urgently. I mean, I'm talking about it from a preserving biodiversity point, but let's think about the mental health point of view. And we saw the enormous benefits of nature that came to the fore in COVID. But what we also saw, Office of National Statistics figures, is that they were far more accessible to white people than they were black people in London. So black people didn't have access to green spaces, didn't have gardens, didn't have that access. It's just, until we get that equality, we're not going to deal with these issues in a forthright and functional way. So that's another issue which we've got to be very conscious of within our sector to make sure that we are opening every single possible door and providing that access to nature to everyone.
Our 2024 season of Planet Possible is supported by one of the leading engineering and design consultancies in the world, AtkinsRéalis. Here at Planet Possible, we bring a diverse range of voices from across the international water and environment sector to explore how to tackle some of the biggest challenges we face. And that aligns perfectly with the AtkinsRéalis purpose of engineering a better future for our planet and its people. We're really grateful to AtkinsRéalis for enabling us to bring another exciting year of Planet Possible to you. Interestingly, Planet Possible that's just gone out, we talk about a study recently on green social prescribing. If you've not heard of it, Google it, it's really interesting. But the study basically says that it's having a really positive impact on people's mental health, about 8,000 people surveyed. But the discussion we had was about the equity, because actually you've got to be able to live near a green space or get access to a green space to be able to benefit from that. So do you think that the kind of wider value of the environment and, for example, health benefits, like specifically mental health benefits, do we value that sufficiently?
Well, we're going to find out, because this government have come in and one of the things that they need to do is address the housing crisis. We've had a large increase in our population, and we need to make sure that people have somewhere to live. We've got a growing homelessness problem and people living in all sorts of poverty related to housing. We've got an excessive number of landlords. We've got millions of empty homes because they're not currently fit to live in. And so we have to have either a refurbishment or a building programme. And one of the things that's upset all of the ENGOs at the moment is the thought that we might be building on the green belt and we might be building in other areas where they're going to impact negatively again on biodiversity. But again, we need to build houses. We don't need to maybe build as many as they say they're going to need to build, because we should be refurbishing those others. But building on the green belt is going to create a hell of a furore. I think the green belt as an ideal is incredibly important, because it's exactly what you're saying. It was designed to allow access to nature, essentially. That doesn't mean you're necessarily bird watching, but being in a green space. So that's something that we will jealously protect. And from an environmental point of view, unless we're going to put up houses which have solar on the roof, car charging points where appropriate, grey water collection so we're not flushing drinking water down the toilet or pouring it on our damn lawns every summer, and critically insulation, we've got the lowest insulation standards of anywhere in Europe. What is the point of putting up affordable housing if people can't afford to heat it because it's all pissing out of the walls and the roof? So again, this is where you need, if we're going to build houses, let's get Angela Rayner, Ed Miliband and Steve Reed all in the same room together and think, oh, how are we going to build these houses and not be bullied by the development sector to make sure that people are getting good value for money and a secure future in a house that they can afford to live in. It's just joined up thinking, isn't it? People have got to join the dots, not just throw up a load of cheap housing on Greenbelt where it's going to pick a massive fight with people like us. But having said all of that, I just need to say one other thing. The housing issue impacts 6% of the UK landscape. So if you came to me and put a gun at my head and say, what can you do? You've got to make one decision on how to improve biodiversity in the UK. I wouldn't pick on housing. Yes, it can be extraordinarily damaging. It can restrict the access to green space. It can be poorly planned, poorly built. But ultimately, if we're just talking about biodiversity, it's farming and forestry, which are 83 to 86% of our land surface. So if you're looking at the bigger picture, the bigger numbers, the bigger impact, that's where we need to focus. But unfortunately, the ENGOs, Natural England, they've all got this thing, they don't want to upset the farmers. We don't want to upset the farmers. Farmers have got a terrible trouble on their hands. They're struggling to turn a profit. They've got high suicide rates. They're being told to do this, that, and the other by DEFRA. What we need to do is help those farmers through that transition, but they've got to change what they're doing. And that's again where we find what we've got to do is avoid conflict through creative conversation with that fraternity, but not avoid that. We can't afford to not upset. It's not the farmers, it's farming policy that has to change. A lot of farmers out there are good at growing wildlife. Let's make sure that they are properly paid for, properly instructed, properly supported to grow that wildlife. Yeah. But that does mean that they'll have to do some things which at the moment are a change in mindset for them. We've got to cut meat and dairy. The Climate Change Committee have said that we need to cut it by 35%. The government's Health Advisory Board say that we've got to cut it by 30%. So there is no ambiguity about that. So as hard as the NFU and the AHDB push back with their ridiculous campaigns telling us that it's healthy and healthy for our planet, we've got to change that mindset. And it's about seeing that as an opportunity, presenting it as an opportunity to our farming fraternity. We want to support them. We want to nurture them through this. I don't know about you, but I'm going to eat at some point today. I haven't yet, but definitely. I'm going to eat at some point today. And so quite clearly, we are not anti-farming, anti-farmers, but what we need is that escalation of progress in those conversations.
Yeah, right. Gosh, somebody just said 5 minutes to go, which is heartbreaking because I've got like so many more questions. So I'm going to rattle through a little bit if that's okay.
Okay, I'll do speedy answers.
No, it's brilliant. One of the other things that people reached out to me about when I said I was going to talk to you was nothing to do with the environment and was all to do with neurodiversity. So there were multiple people that got in touch and said how positively impacted they were by watching your programme, Autism and Me. And I wanted to ask you, I suppose, specifically why you think it's important that we create the conditions to really embrace a neurodiverse workforce in the environment space?
I think it's really important that we have as many people involved in conversations as possible in whatever part of the world that we're interested in being creative, whether it is science, whether it is industry, whether it is art. And what we know is that people like myself think in different ways, and that means sometimes we can offer something to that conversation which maybe others can't. And that's not, I'm not saying that we're unique and we've got all the answers, let's be very clear about that, but I'm saying that we can offer something which maybe other parts of the population can't. And I think that intrinsically that's probably, and we are looking at trying to look actually now at the history and also the kind of archaeology of neurodiversity and how and why this has arisen in our population. And I would imagine that there was a very key, evolutionary stable strategy to have people whose mind work in very different ways. So in a time of crisis, and I'm not just talking about contemporary crisis, but past crisis, there were people who would come up with different ideas, and that would be a way of making sure that those populations could persist. It might be a matter of make or break, certainly a matter of make or break now. And I think that one of the key things, I suppose, from my thinking and the way that my mind works, is that sort of ghastly cliche where people say, you think outside the box. I don't. There isn't a box. I don't see a ceiling. I don't stop. I never think, okay, the idea has to stop here. The idea will run as long as I can run it or invite others to contribute it, to continue to progress it. And that is one thing. I think that one of the things I notice is that people become satisfied with how far an idea is moving, or they become intimidated by the rate of progress, which is really infuriating. But I don't, and many people of my ilk don't have that. So I think that we're also very clear speaking. We don't do small talk. I'm not interested in having a conversation with anyone about the weather. If I want a conversation about the weather, I look at my Met Office app. I'm not interested in some spurious opinion with someone in a Costa coffee queue. It's rubbish. And so from that point of view, we deal with the facts. We can be very didactic. Things are right or wrong, so we express ourselves with clarity. There's no inhibition there. That probably adds to our capacity as forthright campaigners. We're not intimidated. I'm certainly not intimidated by any of the flack that I'm going to get by taking on the meat and dairy industry. It's a duty. I don't see any alternative. So it's immaterial. And I think that therefore that can be a strength. And I'm very happy to take those cases because I genuinely don't care what they think, because I think that my research suggests that I'm right at this point in time. I reserve the right to change my mind given more data, but at this point in time, this is what I think. I'm going to fight for it, and I'm not going to give up.
Well, that's perfectly clear and brilliant. Thank you, Chris. There's lots of nodding, I think, around the room. Right, final question for you, and it's a biggie. So we're called Planet Possible. We are always thinking about the possibilities and the positivity, really. So I'm going to hand you, as is my gift, the reins to the world, right? So you're in charge of the entire world for a few minutes. Internationally, if you could do one thing, make one thing happen, what would you do?
I'd say to everyone living on that world that you are empowered to make a difference for its future. Don't think that it's beyond your scope. People say, I'm just a drop in the ocean. And I say, but what's an ocean but a multitude of drops? See what you can do and do it. And do it now. Because this is a time of crisis, and if we are fortunate enough to grow old and die slowly, there could be a point in our future where some younger person comes up and taps us on the knee and says, what did you do when you really had to make a difference? And if you can't look down at that person, whose world will be very different than ours was when we were kids and is now, then frankly, I don't want that on my conscience. So I think we must all look for opportunities within our lives to make those changes. Now, they don't all arise at the same time, so we can't be impatient with people. I'm plant-based. I wouldn't sit here and tell everyone to stop eating meat. But what I would say to them is, why don't you think about eating less of it? Why don't you explore that, if you're into food, the plant-based menu? Why don't you think about the wider ramifications in terms of animal welfare, impact on biodiversity, emissions, and so on and so forth? And when it's appropriate for you, not when I tell you, because I won't, but when it's appropriate for you, take that step. And if there's one thing I can leave you with, because I think that we all should try and do something, if not every day, but when that opportunity arises, what is the single greatest thing that any one of us here could do today to lower our carbon footprint? And there are two things which stand high above all of the others, and they don't involve paint, glue, powder, or sitting in the road. The first thing is, don't have children. It may be too late for that. Okay. Okay, so let's move on to the second thing, more realistic. I mean, I throw that out there as a form of contraception. If you haven't had children, then maybe just have the one. But I mean, I don't want to get into that, but it is the single biggest thing. Second single biggest thing, right, where you can do more than just stop oil, you can do more than any of that, right, is change where your money is. If you change your bank to an ethical bank, your pension, any other investments you've got, and you go for those people who are not investing in fossil fuels, they're not investing in weapons, and they're not investing in poverty, you will have that is the single biggest difference you can make. Bigger than stopping flying, bigger than stopping eating meat. It's the simple thing, isn't it? If you added up how much all of us here had in our bank accounts, it would be a significant block of money. And if we imagine we all barked with Barclays here, barkingly barked with Barclays here, right? Then basically, if we all just pulled out that day, that would be a blip on their computer, and they'd think, oh, something's happened. Economic protest is the most powerful tool that we've got. And we can do it passively on a phone app in minutes. No risk of arrest, no risk of becoming a social pariah, no risk of the Daily Mail calling you an eco-zealot. Come on, just change your bank account, change your pension, move that money to somewhere where it's doing good, not, I was about to swear, messing up our planet. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. Well, you've got an action. If nothing else, you're taking an action away from today. Go and, if you haven't already, sort out where you bank and do something about it. We've heard themes about making a real change quickly, about looking for compromise, and we've heard some real passion. So all that leaves me to say is thank you for joining us for our first, but hopefully not last, live recording of Planet Possible. Please, final time, let's thank our excellent guest, Chris Packham. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.